friends, I'm michellemarki, and today I'm going to talk about what is greedflation, and is greedflation making you poorer, and if so, what you can maybe do about it, because this topic is highly debated, as some of the answer involves asking the question, what are the major factors contributing to some of the highest inflation we've seen in 40 years, where consumer price index or CPI inflation just hit 9.1% in June 2022, and some of it could be, is it corporate greed or concentrated market power that's contributing so much to inflation? And the answer isn't so simple, because there could be thousands of factors making inflation as high as it is today. And we also got to ask, what is being done to try to bring down inflation? Because I'm sure it's hurting all of our wallets, and I have some suggestions of what we can do and things to keep in mind. So if you are looking forward to trying to combat and stave off inflation, I hope you'll like and subscribe to my video and YouTube channel, and I hope this video helps you, so thanks. And first off, what is greedflation? It's when companies are exploiting a situation of high demand and low supply by excessively raising prices, also known as price gouging, in order to have higher profits. And this could have been happening in some industries, such as perhaps in shipping, where a container from Asia to California used to only cost maybe $1,400 to $3,000, and during the last couple of years could have gone as high as $32,000 per container, and now this has gone down to being in a range of between $8,000 to $10,000 per container. But this is still like 5 times as much as it used to cost. So the fact that shipping container prices have skyrocketed so much is definitely a worrying concern, because this could have downstream effects in causing all other traded goods to also go up in price, such as with used cars, as we saw used car prices skyrocket by something like 40% or more. And that is partially a result of there being a chip shortage. So new chips couldn't go into new cars, so new cars didn't come into the US, and that also led to a shortage of cars. So that may have also led to prices of used cars going up, because if some people need cars, then they got to get them somewhere, and used cars might be the place to get them at. So this is an area where perhaps some companies in the shipping industry could have taken advantage, but they may not necessarily have done so, because there could have been all kinds of supply chain issues at play, and also with workers not being as available. Maybe some shipping companies had to raise their wages in order to get workers to come work on the docks, and also truckers to move some of the supplies out to all the states. So there could have been a whole bunch of reasons, and who knows if the shipping container prices were really justified. But once things calm down a little bit, then the prices start normalizing, because it's not sustainable for companies to keep paying 30 grand for a shipping container, as eventually they'll just stop paying for that kind of price and wait until the price lowers to a more affordable amount. So we could be seeing that now, but we're still off normal levels of what shipping containers used to cost in 2019. And while some industries like shipping and oil and gas have been reaching record profits lately, some of this is part of a larger trend of corporations increasing profit margins over the last 15 years, where the historical average had been something like only 5% of corporate profit margins, and now it's been reaching averages of about 10%. And after the pandemic recession, corporations seem to have reached profit margins as high as between 11 to 12% if we look at corporate profits after tax compared to gross domestic product, or GDP. And we see this trend happening after even the Great Recession. So overall, corporate profit margins have been relatively high over the last 15 years, maybe compared to 40 or 50 years ago when it used to be only 5%. And that could be because companies want to have more profits in order to grow initiatives, or maybe they were really leveraged in using a lot of cheap debt in the last couple of years, and they wanted to juice up returns while they still could before inflation erodes their returns, because with higher inflation, you need to earn more money in order to just overcome the effect of inflation. And also maybe before the pandemic, the amounts of profit margins maybe weren't as big, because maybe companies would squeeze their suppliers and also resist increasing employee wages in order to keep price levels a little bit more down. But with a lot of government support, like a lot of people receive stimulus checks, that might have caused some companies to have to raise wages just to get workers to come back. So this could all be part of like an inflation wage price spiral where the more that workers are demanding higher pay, then that has to go into companies, including that into the expenses of making their products and services. And then that ultimately gets passed on to us as consumers. But also there's some evidence, according to the Economic Policy Institute, that nearly 54% of price increases in non-financial businesses since mid-2020 can be attributed to fatter profit margins compared to just 11% in the 40 years between 1979 and 2019. And even if we're paying 250% more in gasoline costs, where it looks like compared to 2020, gas went from about $2 per gallon to around $5 per gallon. So let's maybe give some gas companies the benefit of the doubt where maybe because of the pandemic slump, they just didn't invest as much in pumping more oil out of the ground because there just wasn't demand. And now we're all paying the price for it as they're all catching up and trying to get the crude oil out of the ground to meet demand. But also some of that could just be because oil and gas companies know that eventually this will normalize, and then supply and demand that's currently out of whack could go back to something resembling almost normal. And also maybe with some government intervention, they might be trying to get some gas prices down for the everyday consumer, as we've been seeing lately. But even if some of that is not much we can control, if gas prices remain high, some things that are within our control are to do things like just drive less, so buy less gasoline, and do things like bike and walk more or carpool, and try to find ways that we're not in need of as much gasoline as we were before. And of course, some could totally be taking advantage of the supply and demand situation that's still totally out of whack, as the high inflation we're dealing with is caused by a number of factors, including positive demand shock and also negative supply shock, where some forms of positive demand shock include how we've seen unprecedented levels of government money printing and stimulus that went into the pockets of millions of consumers, and then all those repressed consumers were unleashed to do a lot of consumer spending after lockdowns were lifted. And also from negative supply shock, where we're still dealing with ongoing supply chain problems and the Ukraine war, and also lockdowns in Asia, like in China and elsewhere, that also withdrew some supply from the world. And also with things like sources for fertilizer coming from Ukraine, that's a big component of food costs. So that's also a pretty big deal if we're not able to get some of the types of goods that went into everyday consumer products anymore. But nonetheless, all the higher costs going up will make some companies have to raise prices. And even though that could be passed on to consumers, it will also lead to some of their profits being reduced eventually. So even though we as consumers could be paying for it, the companies are also paying for hits to their budgets, so that it's kind of not a win-win for anybody the more that inflation continues to be out of control like this. And also, this is ultimately why some argue against the concept of greedflation, because they're saying that corporations didn't just suddenly decide to be more greedy than they were in 2019. They've been greedy this whole time, maybe. And maybe this is just possibly because everything is just out of whack, and nobody is necessarily to blame specifically, except for those who are cognizant that they can get way more money than maybe they did a few years ago. And that could be part of why house sales went up by 20% and the median rent went up by 17%, even though the government's figures are that average rent only went up by something like 5%. And so there could be some homeowners that are taking advantage of a situation where demand was pent up for housing, and maybe they're looking at some of the comps and realizing that they can get more for their house now. So they're trying to get as much as they can, but eventually consumers will be wiser and realize that maybe they don't need to spend as much as they did when supply seemed really scarce, and maybe they have more choice now that people are feeling free to move around and they have more supply available as more housing gets built up or made available as people downsize. So even though some could be taking advantage, hopefully overall this evens out eventually. And one argument in favor of the greedflation theory is that according to research from the Boston Fed, there's been increasing industry concentration that's contributed to accelerating inflationary pressures resulting from supply shortages and tight labor market conditions, which means that some companies may have gained some monopoly or oligopoly power in the ability to raise prices and pass on some of their costs to consumers, because maybe some of their smaller competitors got wiped out over the last couple of years, or maybe there's been more mergers and acquisitions that make some corporations even stronger and then limit the amount of choices to consumers. So if there's only a couple of brands that are really having enough market power, let's say Coca-Cola and Pepsi, you're not going to opt for a Shasta if you really like the taste of Coke or Pepsi. So maybe Shasta is not able to raise their prices as well as Coke and Pepsi can, but there's a limit even to some of these companies that have monopolistic power, because there's only so much that a consumer is willing to pay before a consumer just stops buying the product altogether. So if a Coke starts costing $10 for a can, I'm sure many of us will not buy it unless we're at a ball game, and then maybe we don't have much of a choice if you're really thirsty and you're not willing to drink water from a fountain. But that example aside, for the most part, there's a limit to which any company can raise prices. So eventually, like I said, I think that a lot of the effects of inflation will hopefully normalize the more that the Fed intervenes with doing some quantitative tightening. And that means taking away a lot of the money printing stimulus that really pumped up a lot of the returns companies had. And I've talked about this in some videos before, where quantitative tightening will probably make inflation go down, but that could also lead to a recession. So eventually consumer spending will decrease as they're reaching their limit in terms of what they're willing to pay for everyday goods and service. So that's basically what we can mainly do as consumers, is we always have the power not to spend our money, because as tempting as a cool and refreshing Coke might be, maybe we opt for a healthier choice like a glass of water with lemon and call it a day. And so what do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments what you think about the concept of greedflation. Do you think it's actually happening, or do you think that it's not really a big thing? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope that you get through inflation. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something, please like and subscribe, and take care. Till next time.